Good. Rick is one of our one of Mises UK's fellows. Has written a very, very good book on the foundations of Western law, the uniqueness of Western law.
He's plugging it for me.
All kinds of wonderful
I will be plugging
reviews.
it too.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rick Storey.
So, first things first, I have to apologise for my voice. It might not sound like it at the moment, I have a very bad sore throat. I'm supposed to say at this point.
Oh.
No, tough crowd. So if I do hack something at you, you can have a free copy of my book. Thanks, I should start with some thanks. Kit, thank you for having me here to talk. I thank you for your patience. I've tried to be as prepared as possible. I've changed what I'm going to say so many times. I hope it won't just be an incoherent rant, but you'll let me know afterwards. So, my topic is decentralized law is superior law. Now, immediately, when libertarians hear something like that, they think, oh yeah, fantastic, yeah, this is going to be right up my street. I kind of know what he's going to say. He's probably going to say something about Austrian economics or something like that, or how decentralized law is good for markets and things like that. But actually, that's not really going to be the crux of my talk at all. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that if we just minimize the state, or just get rid of it altogether, that things are necessarily going to be better. Actually, I think most libertarians have quite a modernist thinking about libertarianism. I think they think very, very much in terms of economics, and I think they tend to lose sight of very, very important cultural matters. Kind of culture from which the libertarian principles, the economic freedom that we all value actually grew out of. So we tend to lose sight, if you like, of the flower bed, and so we've got some principles up in a, I don't know, a vase, say, and the flowers are wilting, and we're not really sure what to do about it. That's the sense I have of libertarianism. I'm sorry if this is a very negative start. Okay, I will get to a joke. Okay, but I do think it's important, because these are Brexit-themed talks. This is all Brexit-themed, we're going to be talking about the EU. But I think it's also important to look at the cultural background, what's going on in the West, as we call it, as a whole at the moment, because we are pressing on into post-modernity. Behind us, we have modernist principles which are crumbling away behind us and which we're still trying to make sense of and deal with. And I think I'd say maybe even most of us are probably still hung up on certain modernist principles ourselves. So we really need to get to grips with all of that before we can just start totally criticising the EU and totally emphasising Brexit. Okay. I think that the criticisms often laid at the feet of libertarianism would be something like this. I have in mind like a typical complaint that, say, a conservative or perhaps a typical liberal these days would have of libertarianism. They would say, well, can you imagine, for instance, let's take a third world country. We get rid of the state from that country, and give you 20 years to do that, some nice Rothbardian number like that, to do that. And then what will we have? Well, the best theory at the moment is that insurance companies will do all of the work. They will keep order between individuals where there are disputes, etc. Do we really think that would work? If we took a third world country, we get rid of the state, let's say some African city, we do it in an African city, and we imagine that domestic insurance companies are just going to do all the work, everything's going to be hunky-dory, or maybe some Chinese insurance companies will come in and try to keep some sort of artificial order in the country. Do we really think that this city is going to end up being a bastion of freedom? Now, this is the main criticism that I've had to deal with as a libertarian, and hopefully I'll be able to try and make sense of it and deal with it properly today. Okay. So, where's the joke? There's talk of descending into nihilism and this kind of thing. So, a good old Jewish joke. There was a rabbi, and he was counselling an old married couple. And the husband was complaining about the wife offloads on him as soon as he gets home one day, and the rabbi says to him, well, you know, you're right. He says, I think I deserve better. The rabbi says, yes, I think you're right. The following day, the wife starts complaining about the husband. The husband, I don't know, leaves the toilet seat up or something like that. Doesn't listen to her, that kind of thing. And she says, you know what, I deserve better. The rabbi says, yeah, you know what, you're right. And then, following day, both of them come to the rabbi, and they say to the rabbi, well, you've just told her one thing, you told me another thing. This doesn't seem to make any sense. There's nothing coherent here. You're supposed to be a rabbi, you're supposed to have principles, aren't you? And he says, yeah, you know what, you're right. Again, to them both. And I feel a little bit like this is how people view us from a postmodernist perspective. This is how they're looking at libertarianism. We don't seem to have the principles. We don't seem to have these principles anymore. I think that, well, you know what, I'm just going to stop criticising libertarianism. I'm going to totally alienate the crowd before I've even begun. But what does all this talk of postmodernism have to do? Well, with the EU, with Brexit, well, it has everything to do with it. I see Brexit as being just a simulacrum of the warring dichotomies and secular categorizations that we've been left with from modernism. We are like the fickle rabbi. This is what we've learned at school. We've learned all these modernist concepts, all these divergent ideas, the left and right of politics, and all of that. And we're just totally stuck in that. We're totally stuck in it. Francis Fukuyama, probably one of the most famous sociologists, I would say, in the world, he, of course, said that liberal democracies are the end of human history. The end of human history. There'll be no more violence, no more war. It's all going to be wonderful. And he pointed to the EU as the pinnacle of this human achievement. Yeah, he did. Yeah, that people think he said the United States was the perfect example. No, he pointed to the EU. And of course now, he's totally backtracked from that position. Why? Well, because the EU, along with modernity, we might say, is crumbling. It is collapsing. And Brexit is just an example of that. But of course we have Central European states who are more identitarian and Christian, and they're not happy about mass immigration, etc. And of course Italy is trying to kamikaze the economy of Europe, I think. So there are lots of reasons that he would have backtracked from this position. What I want to impress on you, though, is that just because we leave the EU, that doesn't mean that circumstances are automatically going to get better. Just because we leave, it doesn't mean that our economic, political elites are suddenly going to start believing in something, and that we are actually going to obtain some kind of identity, something strong enough culturally from which libertarianism emerged. And that's what we want. We want something like that. We want to see more freedom in the future. So, we need to have set principles. We need to have a cultural framework put back in its place in order for libertarianism to arise in any shape or form, and hopefully, yes, in a decentralized form. Okay, so let me actually define my terms. I'm actually talking about decentralized law. It's supposed to be superior. So what on earth do I mean by decentralized law? When I talk about decentralized law with libertarians, typically they will think of a number of things. They might think of criminal law versus civil law, or something like public law versus private law, something like that. So public law is the law governing the relationship between the state and the individual. Okay? Private law is like civil law, so it's contracts, it's dispute between individuals. It's private. Okay? But I think I have a better definition. Yes, it's from my book. They're saying to themselves, why didn't he just put it on his piece of paper? But then I couldn't do this. So this is from Professor Bruce L. Benson, and he really wrote the book on decentralized law. He wrote a book that was a few decades old now, it got totally swept under the academic carpet, called, what was the name of it? The Enterprise of Law, Justice Without the State. And so he describes the difference between decentralized, centralized law like this. It is a widely held belief that state governments and law develop together, and therefore that law and order could not exist in a society without the organized authoritarian institutions of the state. But law can be opposed from above by some coercive authority, such as a king, a legislator, or a Supreme Court, or law can develop from the ground as customs and practice evolve. And so this idea of customary law is more what I have in mind. It's something that's developing organically as social norms develop, and yes, the culture is what's influencing that. Okay, it's not just an economic process. Okay. Law. What does law mean? Well, in English, our word law, it comes from a Germanic word. I think we might get it from the Vikings. Say again.
Viking word?
Yeah, I was just about to say, yeah, I think we get it from the Vikings, but I think other Germanic peoples have the similar idea of a slightly similar word. And so the idea of law is just order, some kind of order. But of course, this begs the question, well, what kind of order? What does that even mean? I think a problem here is that most people, when you say law, they think you're talking about legislation. They think of this Latin word lex, legis. This is the top-down, imposed, coercive state law that Benson's talking about. No. When we're talking about law in its old Germanic sense, we're talking about something more akin to natural law. So we're talking about something that's more organic, it's more from the bottom up, and it's more as the customs evolve. And it is a very cultural thing, so it will differ from place to place. This is how you end up with different jurisdictions, even within the same country sometimes. Okay. And so this is essentially the topic at hand. What is the order that we're after? What is justice? There are different definitions of justice. We have distributive justice. This is kind of egalitarianism. We have retributive justice. This is like vengeance for things that we all agree is bad. You know, we want to see someone harmed so that this is dissuasive from people doing it in the future. We've got restorative justice. So that will be, for instance, you have a plaintiff or a victim and you want to put them in the same situation as they were in before the dispute occurred or the crime occurred. What kind of justice are we after? What kind of law do we want? What is the order? Well, this is the Mises Institute, and of course Mises can help point us in the right direction if we're trying to think about things a little bit more empirically. So Mises, of course, wrote his book, Human Action, very famous book, and the idea for Mises was that he wanted to try and find some a priori concepts that were going to be supplementative to economics as an empirical science. He wasn't a total rationalist. I think that's probably a bit of a mischaracterization of him. But he was able to determine that humans act. Humans act. Of course, if you try to disprove that, what are you? Just a human acting. If you try to get around it, well, why should we have to listen to anything else you have to say? Some people describe this as a tautology, others say it's an irrefutable axiom. What we can all agree on is that humans also interact. We're constantly interacting. We have our goals, and we're constantly trying to navigate around the goals of others, around group expectations. And this is how we have to be thinking. We've got to be thinking in a more cultural sense, we've got to be thinking in a more communal sense. Something that we fail to do very, very often. Okay. So, immediately, as soon as we start talking about what kind of order we're going to have for men, societies of people, then we run into another modernist concept, which we are, I think probably most of us in the room, totally sold on. The modern concept of man. This is another big problem in libertarian circles, I think. A lot of people will hold to a very Hobbesian conception of man without even realizing it. They will agree totally with the kind of Enlightenment ideas of man, and say that, yes, okay, in history, man was red in tooth and claw, our lives were short, brutish, and nasty. But then eventually this leads into a kind of contractarianism. So these are the kind of, well, how are we going to solve this? The communist or the fascist, the totalitarian statist would say, well, we have one social contract with one state, and this is our predictable Leviathan state. And because it's predictable, that means we can actually make predictions for the future for our businesses and everything, and society can grow and develop. On the other hand, though, what are the libertarians posing as the alternative? 1,000,001 contracts between everyone, and that's it. So it's still very contractarian. The law is still very positivistic. It's still something imposed, whether it's imposed by an insurance company between two individuals, or whether it's imposed by the state as a whole. Perhaps you disagree with me. It will be a conversation for lunch, I'm sure. One moment. But where did libertarian principles come from? Where did they come from? A situation where there's insurance companies and contract? No. They grew out of Western civilization. I'm just going to give you a very, very, very truncated story of Western civilization to describe how we arrived at these principles that I think most of us would claim to love. So, 10,000 years ago, let's say, and forward, we had Indo-Europeans. We don't actually really know what to call them. Not that long ago, you may remember there was a group that called them Aryans. They came into Europe, not all at once, but in spits and spurts over 10,000 years. These people were obviously rather psychopathic. They would strip themselves naked and fight. Well, they invented berserker warfare, basically. They would paint themselves up. They would show total disregard for their lives in warfare. How did that evolve? I have no idea. I could speculate that perhaps they thought that doing that, it would make them look really great, and so their children would have a better reputation. Who knows? But that's the situation. So Europe then evolved a plurality of warrior kings who were obviously very concerned with kudos and glory from their peers. And so this is how, particularly in Southern Europe, you ended up with a very aristocratic system of these warrior lords. But more importantly, it's how we ended up with a plurality of jurisdictions, with these kings all fighting each other, and also respecting each other's decisions, judicial decisions. Fast forward a little bit, along comes Christianity. Christianity emerges also with Christianity actually emerged from a Hellenistic milieu in that part of the world. I won't name it for political correctness' sake. Yes, so it was very much influenced by these principles, these Indo-European principles which the Greeks had brought over. Christianity is obviously very individualistic in a sense. Yes, we talk about the corporate body of Christ, but it's also very individualistic in the sense that an individual woman and child within a family were considered to have as much love from God, and they were considered to be made in the image of God as much as anyone else, as much as the paterfamilias of the family, the head of the family. So, what emerged from this? Christianity comes into Northern Europe, there are all these warrior kings. They find they have a tremendous amount of agreement. They find that there is a lot of agreement in terms of fostering this plurality of jurisdictions, as I said before, but also, more importantly, the way that decisions were made was organic. The law was very much judge-discovered, and it was more rationalistic, and so it wasn't simply some Oriental despot imposing his will. This was a much more organic process, and obviously the customs and the norms would have differed across all the many micronations which would have been scattered across Europe in the Middle Ages. Something that's very important, though, that we need to consider. Whereas the state acts as a kind of Uncle Sam, as a kind of single patriarch to rule over them all, one ring to rule them all. In the medieval setting, what you had was, yes, patriarchies. I know that word isn't very popular at the moment, but we never really had anything other than patriarchy, so I don't feel that uncomfortable about talking about it. A plurality of patriarchies, and I don't just mean the kings, but the church as well. The church was exercising its own law as well and had its own hierarchical system, which was very patriarchal. Of course, abbot comes from the word abba, which means father, and the universities as well. They took up the same trend, and they were also able to exercise their own independence. And guilds as well, of course, on the economic side of things. These were patriarchal, little patriarchal systems, and they had their own law. They were self-governing. I could go on with other examples, but the point I want to stress here is that there was a definite, decentralized, but patriarchal system. It was a very cultural thing, and it required men in different systems of hierarchy who were prepared to stand on principles, on real beliefs, and not just hand over their responsibility to some insurance company or some state or something like that. No, it was theirs. They took the responsibility on themselves. And so it's from this that the traditional Christian doctrine of subsidiarity has come into existence. And this is why the church, albeit it adopted a lot of secular ideas and it adopted a lot of statism, yes, let's be honest, and in fact it could be argued that it maybe even gave rise to statism. For a very, very long time, even let's say to 1500, we had advanced, stateless societies, civilizations. And it was a result of men believing something transcendental, which was informing their laws, which was informing their culture, their everything. Especially their conception of man, their fellow man, who was considered to be their brother, in one body, a loving body in Christ. And so this is light years away, this kind of thinking, from what libertarians have in mind as being what ideal authority is supposed to be, what an ideal society is supposed to be. Nevertheless, that is from where we get our libertarian principles. That's where they emerged from. So I suggest we have a lot of thinking about what our conception of man really is. I'm not the first to say this, far from it. Jeff Deist, I think it was last year, in his Mises speech, it's called the Blood and Soil speech. Imagine how popular that was in the mainstream media. He said, "It remains true that civil society should be celebrated by libertarians at every turn. To believe otherwise is to ignore what humans actually want and actually do, which is create communities. There is a word for people who believe in nothing, not government, not family, not God, society, morality, or civilization, and that word is nihilist." And that is precisely where the postmodern West is heading if we continue to throw off our spiritual authority, our spirituality basically. If we continue to chop down the ladder to heaven that we once had, and if we also, for similar reasons, continue to totally deroot ourselves, hyper-individualize ourselves, and look for some kind of identity in, I don't know, some sort of bizarre hairstyle, or some agenda that you might totally make up, for instance. God bless you. So yes, Christianity kept the rise of the state, kept at bay the rise of the state until, let's say, about 1500, you can say, and that was because of subsidiarity. Okay. Let me just address the economic side of things as well, because Dr. Saloni and Matteo is going to be talking about the commercial revolution in Christendom a little bit. So on the economic side of things, okay, yeah, decentralisation, it's fantastic. We all know this. I was talking about Bruce Benson, quote from my book. I interviewed Bruce Benson, and he told me that in his experience as a lawyer working in commercial law, most businesses want to resolve their disputes out of court. So they want arbitration, and they want as their judge someone who's actually worked in the business, because then they know what they're talking about. Nothing needs to be explained or defined for them. They know the ins and outs, and it's quick, and it's cheap, and it's fast. And that's what people want. If we're talking about economics, isn't that what we want? We want predictability, speed, efficiency. And that is what decentralisation does to law. And not just on the commercial side of things. Yes, okay, there is that. When we look at the origins of commercial law, it was in this decentralised setting of Christendom. Sorry, I clicked my thumb there. Hope that doesn't weird anyone out. Some people don't like that. So, Bruce Benson says that by the end of the 11th century, the law merchant had developed to such a degree that it governed virtually every aspect of commercial transactions in all of Europe, and in some cases outside of Europe. In fact, the commercial revolution of the 11th through the 15th centuries that ultimately led to the Renaissance and Industrial Revolution could not have occurred without the rapid development of this system of privately adjudicated and enforced customary law. Okay? So this is in the decentralized Christian setting, and you have just individual businessmen building up the foundations of what we know as commercial law today. Indeed, this law, the law merchant from the medieval period, so much, the majority of commercial law today still comes from these principles. These were not judges, these were businessmen trying to handle their own affairs, and weren't they lucky that they had a cultural framework so that when they're travelling across many, many different jurisdictions across Europe, that they can arrive somewhere and they know that the people will have exactly the same values as they have, and the judges will have basically the same law, same principles. Would that happen if we had a totally decentralised sense of culture, as well as decentralised politics, economics, whatever? I'm not convinced. But on the bright side, the decentralisation of economic jurisdiction is making a comeback. There's a lovely book by Tom Bell. It was by Cambridge University Press, surprisingly. It's called Your Next Government, and I can't remember the subtitle. Something about stateless nations. I can't remember. Your Next Government, that's the main one. And he talks about this rising trend across the world in special jurisdictions, special economic jurisdictions. The most famous of which, of course, is Dubai and the DIFC courts. And that's, of course, based on British common law. They got a British judge to come over and to set it out nicely for them. And of course, that's been so successful, it's now proliferating outside the DIFC courts in Dubai, and lots of other people are starting to use it for all sorts of things. So this really does work, and of course Dubai is an economic success. A similar situation in Hong Kong. There are many other examples. So economically, yes, decentralized law is superior law. We can say that for sure. But we need the principles, we need the culture to keep it all together, to keep it coherent. Otherwise we wouldn't have even had the British common law in the first place to inform the DIFC courts in Dubai. So I've been talking about subsidiarity. What is subsidiarity? I don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to say this really, really quickly. Okay? Subsidiarity is the traditional Christian principle that a community of a higher order shouldn't interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, because that deprives the individual of his responsibility, something which is very necessary for maintaining those freedoms. So there are three examples. I'm going to steal your little gag here a little bit, Andy. I want to talk about the good, the bad and the ugly of Switzerland, the EU and Liechtenstein. Switzerland is governed on the principle of subsidiarity. The problem with Switzerland is that whilst you have parties like the SVP, this is the Swiss Folk Party, and they say, oh, our country is totally built on Christian principles, and of course they have a Protestant and a Catholic interplay there. So the Catholics have obviously pushed subsidiarity. Is that your way of saying my 30 minutes are up?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. You're nearly there. That's good. Where was I? So yeah, so Switzerland has this principle of subsidiarity. The problem is, I taught a Swiss lady, and she was a commercial lawyer, a company lawyer, sorry, for a big energy company in Switzerland. And she said, nevertheless, there are always international concerns that will get pressed upon all levels of government in Switzerland, from the smaller commune level, the canton level. And obviously she worked in energy, so she said they will force them to comply with various EU guidelines, etc., so that the electricity can be distributed from, say, Germany to Italy seamlessly. But there's more than that. We end up with concerns. What about terrorism? What about cyber security threats? What about Russia? Ooh. All of these threats. And of course they require a tremendous amount of secrecy from a tremendously centralized force. Where is the recourse for any decisions that are made for the average Swiss man? Some sort of judicial review? Is that available to him? Even if they were an EU citizen? Is that really the sort of thing that the reasonable man on the Clapham omnibus is going to do? Judicial review against the EU? Terribly expensive, terribly time-consuming. And who makes the final decision anyway? Who decides the issues in subsidiarity to say, the individual man is not capable of handling this. This neighbourhood is not capable of making this ultimate decision. And that's where the EU will step in. And the EU, of course, is also supposed to be governed on the principle of subsidiarity. That's in Article 5 of the Lisbon Treaty. Are they? No. No. It's very clearly set out. Central power decides what the issues are, and they decide when they step in. What can possibly stop this? Individual responsibility. And we have to have some shared ideas in order to all be on board with that. Are we supposed to even trust each other in systems like this? We certainly don't trust our political elites. Studies have shown that they're made up largely of sociopaths. It's hardly surprising. Liechtenstein has an idea. I think they're probably more subsidiarist, I think that's the word, than Switzerland. I don't know if you've read His Serene Highness's, Hans Adam II's book, The State in the Third Millennium. But I think he was very wise in allowing his people to democratically decide whether they still wanted him as their monarch, which they did. And why did they decide that? Because of course he has granted them the ability to totally secede from Liechtenstein if they want. A village can totally secede if they wish to, in protest. We need to get back to that. We need to get back to actual relationships between real people, between men, between systems, different hierarchies. Without that, without those relationships and those shared ideas, without that cultural framework, I'm afraid I don't think decentralised law can work. Even though, yes, it is superior in economic principles, and even though it's superior at doing what law does, splitting up the decision-making means less bad decisions, less one-size-fits-all for all of us. So, with that, I think I'll shut up. I'm way over time, and I'll pass you on to the very good Dr. Matteo Salonia. Thank you very much for your patience.